Hi guys, it's Coffee here and welcome to another video. In today's video we're going to be checking out this. This is the Fuji 70-300mm lens that came out in about March earlier this year, and I've owned it since about April, May time, so I've had it for about 6 months now, and I thought about doing a video as soon as I picked it up, but thought, you know what, let's do a bit more of a detailed review this time. So I've owned this lens for a little while, and in this video we're going to be going through lots of images and videos that I've taken over the last 6 months with this lens. We're also going to go into some of the specs and just general thoughts in terms of how I think it performs and how it fits into, I guess, my ecosystem with my cameras. So to kick this video off, let's first of all go through some of the specs, and we're going to start off with the size and weight of this lens, as that's the main reason I picked this up, and it definitely doesn't disappoint in this department. Now, something you need to consider with this lens, being a 70-300mm, that means it's about 100 to 450mm in terms of a full frame equivalent, and it fits in the size of my hand. This lens comes in at a 580 grams, and I'll put a couple of comparisons up on the screen now of some of the other lenses that I own, and it will stand out that this lens is a very lightweight lens for that huge focal length that you're getting. When closed down, this lens is about 13 centimeters in length, so it's about 130mm, and that means that it fits very nicely into my Billingham Hadley small. And that means into my Billingham Hadley, which is a pretty small shoulder bag, I can get a massive zoom lens like this, along with something like my 16-55mm and the Fuji X-T4 body. And that is incredible in terms of me being able to cover something like 16mm all the way through to 300mm in a small compact bag. Inside of here there is 17 elements in 12 groups, and they have both your spherical and your ED elements in there. Also, for a lens this small, it also has weather sealing. Now personally, I'm not sure how much I trust weather sealing on a lens which kind of zooms externally. I've always kind of felt that it feels a little bit wrong, but it's good to know that this lens should withstand that, and if it's something that you want to do, you want to be taking this out with you in sort of bad conditions, that this lens should cope with it. And I found myself, whilst I was in the Lake District shooting landscapes, really liking the fact that this is weather sealed. Now I guess some people might view the next bit as a bit of a downside, but this lens is made out of plastic. Its construction is generally plastic, but it doesn't feel cheap. Now I personally would rather that this lens was the lightweight lens that it is and isn't made out of metal than be made out of metal and weigh an awful lot more. The lens by no means feels cheap at all, but you can tell that it's not built to the same level as some of the other Fuji lenses. Now hopefully from the videos and images that you've seen already up to this point, you'll be seeing that this is a pretty high performing lens. Now the aperture in here is variable, so as you zoom in you will change from f4 up to f5.6, so it's f4 at the 70 and it's f5.6 at the 300. That means if you're shooting as you zoom in, there will be points at which the aperture value will change. Now that can be a bit of a downside for some people, and you might notice it in things like video. However, f4 and f5.6 isn't exactly slow, and you'll still get a pretty shallow depth of field. And I guess if you are looking at lenses that are faster, that are still zoom lenses, they tend to be really big. So I guess f4 and f5.6 isn't that bad, really. This lens on my Fuji X-T4 does feel pretty well balanced, mainly because it's quite lightweight. However, this lens does increase an awful lot in length. So I think earlier on I said it goes from 13mm, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is somewhere more like 30mm. It's pretty long when it's zoomed out, especially if you have the like lens shade on as well. This ends up being really long, and at this point it's not that it's unbalanced, but what I sometimes find is that when I've got it on the Fuji X-T4 and I'm kind of zoomed in, panning around looking through the viewfinder, that I forget how long the lens is, especially if you've got someone stood next to you. It's really easy to kind of pan around and hit them with it because it's so light, you don't really notice the weight, and you forget that it's kind of like 30 centimeters off the end of your camera. Sometimes with a lens like this, they suffer from something called lens creep, which is when you put it onto your camera and kind of point it down, that the lens just kind of zooms on its own with gravity. And this lens, I haven't had any of that with it. Even if you kind of shake it, it really doesn't want to come out, and that's partly because it feels very well built, and as you twist it, it's actually quite stiff. If, however, over time that is something that will loosen up, Fuji do have you covered. There is a lock button on it, and you can turn that on to stop it creeping out. So it's good that they've got you covered. Not really something that I've needed yet so far. In terms of autofocus with this lens, I've been pretty blown away at how quickly this focuses. I am using the Fuji X-T4, so on other cameras I guess it could be slightly worse. I'm probably best case scenario here using the X-T4. However, this goes from near to far focusing so fast, it's pretty unbelievable. On the side of the lens, there is a switch that lets you change it between kind of the full focus range or the 5 meter to infinity focus range with autofocus. Now what that means is if you set it to the 5 meter to infinity, your camera will not try and focus on anything closer than 5 meters, which for a lot of lenses like this can really speed them up. However, I personally do not find myself using this switch that often because the autofocus is so fast that I haven't really felt a need to turn it on. One of the downsides I found with the autofocus of this lens is it is reasonably loud. If you're shooting in a really quiet environment and you're shooting video, there's a good chance that your camera will pick up the audio of the lens. Now, it's not something that I have found to be too much of a problem. Most of the time I'm shooting outside of a lens like this and there's some sort of ambient sound that kind of masks it, but I have noticed it coming out in some of my video clips, and I'll put a video on the screen now and you should probably be able to hear it focusing. Now, one thing that a lens like this does need is very good optical stabilization. And I say that because if you've gone and bought a small compact zoom like this, the last thing you want to then do is lug around a tripod. Fuji claimed that this camera has 5.5 stops of optical stabilization. And I think there's two main ways of looking at this. One of them is in video. So if I zoom this lens to 300mm, these are some video clips now that have been shot 300mm handheld. And you'll see that it's actually pretty good. It seems pretty incredible that I'm able to hand hold something that's at the equivalent of 450mm full frame. What you do notice though with the optical stabilization is if you are zoomed in and you're kind of panning following a subject, you'll see that the stabilization sometimes tries to stable out your pan, and therefore you can kind of sometimes get footage that as you pan around kind of goes, stops, goes, stops, goes, stops, which is a bit of a downside to having it, but it's better than just having a shaky bit of footage anyway. In terms of photos then, I've had a bit of a go and I haven't looked at these images yet to see how well I can handhold this camera with stabilization on and off. Be interesting to see what the results are. I'll put them on the screen now. Looking at it just whilst I was taking the photos yesterday, I think I was struggling to handhold with no stabilization. I think the 250th mark is where I was starting to struggle, whereas you'll see, I think all the way down to something like an 1/8 of a second I was able to handhold, which I guess goes to show that the 5.5 stops is probably about right. Now, one thing that might be a little bit odd about a lens like this is the fact that it's actually pretty good at macro. Because it zooms in so far and has a close focusing distance of just 83 centimeters, you can zoom in pretty close to some objects. I've got a few images and I'll put them on the screen now. I personally am not really into macro photography, and I think if I was, I'd probably buy a dedicated macro lens. But I guess just walking around with this lens, sometimes I've seen cool insects and things that I've wanted to take a picture of, and this lens does a pretty good job of it. And because you're shooting at such a long focal length, the depth of field can be tiny, which if that's something you're into, that can also be pretty good for macro shots as well. So then what are the alternatives to this lens? What other options are out there if this lens you're not sure is for you? Now, I think the most obvious one was the old 55 to 200mm. I'm not sure if you can still buy them new. When I was looking at them used, you could save about £100–150 to go for the older version, but you are losing out on a whopping 100mm at the long end. And for me personally, I decided I didn't want to lose out on the 100mm on the weather resistance for the sake of about £100–150. Fuji also has the 100 to 400mm, which is probably the closest lens in terms of focal length. For that money, you're getting the extra 100mm at the end, but you are also paying twice as much and getting twice the weight. I think at the end of the day, people will sit in two different buckets as whether they want that lens or this lens. I don't think they're that similar in terms of which one you'd want to buy. I think if you're really into telephoto photography, like, I don't know, you shoot wildlife and sports, then you'd probably go for that massive lens anyway. Whereas if you're more like the average Joe that's not really that into telephoto photography but wants a very good lens that they can actually take with them without having to lug it around, then I think you probably look at this lens straight away. So I think even though they're similar in terms of their focal lengths, I think their use in real life is actually pretty different. So in conclusion then, what do I think of this lens? If it's not obvious, I absolutely love this lens, and I am so glad that I picked this up a few months back now. It's come out with me on every trip, partly due to its light size, its lightweight, and the fact that it is weather sealed. And it's really hard sometimes to put a value on the fact that this lens comes with me everywhere. And it's ridiculous that a 70 to 300mm lens can come with me wherever I go and fit into just my Billingham Hadley small. And it's because of that reason I've got a lot of use out of this lens. I wouldn't want a higher performing lens if it came at the cost of size and weight, because I just wouldn't take it anywhere. The fact that this is weather sealed just adds again to the fact that I can take this out wherever I go. I personally have absolutely no issues with the performance of this lens. I'm sure the bigger lenses probably do have slightly higher performance, but personally, I'm never going to notice that performance, not if it's sat at home. If you've enjoyed this video though guys, please don't forget to like and subscribe. There's plenty more content like this coming. If you've got any questions about anything you've seen in this video, then please hit me up down below in the comments and I'll try and get back to you. Thank you guys for watching. Cheers.